Okay, well, I think we should get started. I think there may be some other people popping in as we go along, but thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Melissa Smith from Ferris, and from our very own English Literature and World Languages Department. And I think you all know what this is about because we've been marketing the heck out of it, and I think it should be a really good presentation. So thanks again, Melissa, and take it away.
Okay, so just like a thumbs up, you can hear me and you can see me? Everything's good?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, real quick, just my name is Melissa Smith, and I have a PhD in English studies, but my emphasis was children's literature. So most of what I do and research and I talk about is children's literature and young adult literature. So I'm really interested in girlhood in general and how do we define girlhood. I would tell you putting this together was insanely difficult because we could just do like 3 years of girlhood studies at Artworks. Like that's all we would do and we still wouldn't cover everything. So I'm definitely going to talk in like generalities today. But yeah, so what I want to do today is kind of talk about how girlhood has changed over time and how it's been portrayed in literature and other kinds of media. So when I talk about children's literature, I'm talking about other sorts of texts. And I want to go ahead and start with this quote, and I'm not going to do a ton of this, like making you read off a screen, but I really like this quote. It's, "Children's literature is a powerful medium that conveys the ideas and perspectives of society in a child-friendly form for young readers. The messages contained in children's books therefore have immense importance. The stories told within their pages influence the ways in which children see and react to the world around them." So it's really easy to see how kids might read something and see images or hear stories and how that might influence the world that they experience. But what we don't sort of always recognize is how much those books influence what we see as normal. So our lives are, you know, there are a series of events of craziness, but we put those events into some sort of narrative, right? We're the main characters in our own stories, and then we're also like supporting characters in other people's stories. And so I want to start by talking about how stories sort of shape us, right? So I want us to remember that, you know, all of us have heard hundreds and thousands of stories. So we started hearing stories as young children, and our parents told those stories to us. We, of course, were exposed to books and TV and media that were given to us when we started to read ourselves. We hear stories in our nursery rhymes. We hear stories in the playground, and we tell them to each other. And so over time, our understanding of the world is shaped by hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of stories. And we aren't just exposed to stories that are like purposely given to us, right? So when I was a kid, I remember staying up and watching Star Trek: The Next Generation with my family, or my mom is on this call, so maybe she knows this or doesn't, but I would sneak out of bed and watch Mama's Family when I was up. And I would even say like the stories I read and watched as a kid influenced my very first TV crush, right? So our stories really do influence us. Now, as adults in this room, we can look at a single story and we can say, oh, that story influenced me and that's important. But we have been exposed to those thousands of stories. But when kids are young, they're not exposed to hundreds and thousands of stories. So their worldview is narrower, right? And so we have to think about how these stories might influence us and what are the patterns that we keep seeing, right? So all we really know about the world when we're a kid is what these stories have told us. So even if what might seem true or truth with a capital T seems really obvious to you, our stories might change that and might influence how we view the world. So let's talk about what are some of the like main stories we see over time, right? So specifically, we see this pattern of the princess girl, right? So little girls are told that they are pretty princesses. They have to be thin. They have to be beautiful. They have to be stylish, and they're only allowed to eat one piece of chocolate. Every commercial you ever see where a woman is allowed to have a piece of chocolate, it's one piece of chocolate. Nobody eats just one piece of chocolate. It's wrong. I'm gonna die on. And of course, right, boys are exposed to that same thing. So what do we know about the boy? Well, the boy is a mischievous boy, right? They're told that they're dirty, they're loud, they have to be warriors, they must be tough, they must be macho, they have to be violent. And these are the stories that can be really problematic when we perpetuate these patterns and stories that never stop, right? So a single movie, a single book isn't the problem. The problem when it's hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of what we see as the norm. So let's talk about historically. So between the time about 1850 to 1920, we would call that the golden age of children's literature. And that's when children's literature started to become very popular, and it became actually profitable for authors to start writing and illustrating books for kids. And so I chose some of the most classic texts that maybe we're familiar with. So we start with Alice. Alice's Adventure in Wonderland came out in 1865. It was illustrated by Tenniel. And if we look at Alice here, we can see, you know, a pretty traditional image of what a girl looks like. Of course, we're not color plating yet, so we're only in black and white in these books. But she's wearing a dress, she's wearing stockings and shoes, she has long hair. I will point out though, she's not sexualized, and she's not particularly thin or fat, right? She's plump, she still has a little of her baby weight. We see the same thing with Jo in Little Women. So she's older, of course, when that story begins, but she's wearing the same kind of outfit. Her hair is long here. It's up. But again, we have, you know, a very traditional version of what it means to look like a girl. And then Dorothy was sort of cutting edge because Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they started using color blocks. So we did get a little bit of color. But again, we're seeing girls in a very traditional sort of setting. And so what does she look like in this time period? So first of all, we have to think about what she actually looks like physically and what she's wearing. Where we find her and what is she doing? How does she act? So all of these girls that were popular were white. They were plump, but not overweight. So they weren't, they might call it maybe a healthy weight. They're true to the age of the character. So I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this, but Dorothy in Wizard of Oz is 6 years old. We don't see that in the movie versions, right? In some of the updated versions. But when the book first came out, there was an emphasis on making sure she looked 6 years old, which is really important, instead of constantly having young girls look at images of much, much older kids. Most of them had long hair, and they were all able-bodied. So even today, it's very rare to find main characters that are differently abled, that are in a wheelchair, have a limb loss, are suffering from some sort of disease or some sort of disability, and that can be really problematic. Of course, she's wearing her dresses, her stockings, her ribbons, her lace, her flowers. Here we have Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables, which is a little bit later, right, 1908, but we're still in that golden age time period. As far as her actual characteristics goes, we see her at home, right? So these are very domestic stories. And so where their adventures take place usually start at home and they wind up back at home. They are in areas where girls are allowed to have power, which is fairly limited during this time period. So it would be places like a library, a church, in gardens, right? So the very domestic sort of stories. And what's interesting though is that these girls during the golden age of children's literature actually were pretty rebellious, which is kind of exciting if you think about it. So they were curious, they were adventurous, they tended to reject stereotypes. So you have girls like Anne Shirley who tried to go and do what she wanted and not be limited by the stereotypes of the time. And I think that that's really important because I think that what we kind of would maybe expect to see is we would sort of assume that the girls that we saw in these books in the late 19th century and early 20th century were very stereotyped, and that over time it just kept progressively getting better, right? So we assume they're going to be stereotypical, and then there's more representation, there's more improvement, we start breaking stereotypes, and then today we have these modern girls with all sorts of appearances, and they can wear any kind of clothes they want, and they can be as masculine or as feminine as they want. That is not what actually happens. We have all kinds of forces constantly sort of shaping these girls. So we have female main characters who are even more stereotyped. We have female main characters who they break certain stereotypes and then affirm other stereotypes. Unfortunately, during the mid 20th century, a very common sort of tactic would be for an author to write a character as if he were a boy, and then at the end just sort of slap a girl on top of it, which isn't the answer. The answer to diversity and inclusion and empowerment for women is not to eliminate any traits that are seen as feminine or to only celebrate those traits that we see as masculine. The answer is to allow children, boys and girls, to do and say and wear what they want in whatever form they want, so that they can have that kind of freedom. And I hesitated to include some of these images here. This is Harriet the Spy. She, of course, is fairly adventurous. Her clothing is a little bit more masculine. We have Ramona Quimby. We have, of course, the Dick and Jane and Sally books, right? And then, of course, we have Wonder Woman. And these are all characters who've very much influenced the way we see the world around us, and that they're images that kids see. And then we have to start thinking about the other kinds of texts that we start exposing children to, because when we are talking about contemporary literature, we also are including things like movies and toys. And so we have characters like Barbie. We have retellings of these classic stories that have very much changed the way we view them. So, of course, in the Judy Garland version of Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they cast her. She was 15 when they started filming. They did her chest down in an attempt to try to, really was no attempt made to try as a 6-year-old, right? Same thing happened with changed the way she looked. We have, of course, Bratz dolls and more Barbies, Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen. We have Abby from Sesame Street, Powerpuff Girls, American Girl dolls. Like, all of these different images shape the way young children, specifically girls, see themselves and see the world around them. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this book that sort of encapsulates all the craziness that's happening in the mid-20th century. It's called I'm Glad I'm a Boy, I'm Glad I'm a Girl, and it's by Whitney Darrow Jr. I'm just going to tell you the story first, and then I'm going to tell you more about it. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I am going to read most of the pages. Boys have trucks. Girls have dolls. Boys are doctors. Girls are nurses. Boys are policemen. Girls are meter maids. Boys are football players. Girls are cheerleaders. Boys are pilots. Girls are stewardesses. Boys are presidents. Girls are first ladies. Boys fix things. Girls need things fixed. Boys build houses. Girls keep houses. Boys are grooms. Girls are brides. I'm glad you're a girl. I'm glad you're a boy. So first of all, I have so many problems with this book. I can't even stand it. And especially the one where boys fix things and girls need things fixed. It like makes my skin crawl a little bit. But I will tell you that so Whitney Darrow, he was a satirist, okay? And I'm just taking that back so you can see his name. He published this in 1970. Now, he has never come out and said, and he's passed away now, but he's never come out and said that he wrote this as a parody. But we can infer that maybe it was a parody because he wrote satire for the New York Times for a great many years. And his father was also a really popular satire. I can never say the word satirist. But whether he wrote it as satire or not doesn't really matter because it got published and then libraries across the country started buying it and people started buying it. And you can even today find copies of this in public libraries. Some of them are historical archives, right? So that it's kept for historical reasons so that you can study it. But there are places in Michigan where you can walk into a library and check this out as a child. So whether it was meant to be, parody or satire or not doesn't matter because it was absolutely embraced by part of the American public. And I think that that really demonstrates, even as recently as 1970, which isn't that long ago, how just divisive these ideas were and how much people didn't really notice the problems. Now, it's really obvious to see the problems in the actual actions that these people are doing, but there's also actions in the way that she's portrayed. So first of all, of course, both of these characters are white. It wasn't until, the mid 20th century that you started having picture books that really featured people of color. If we look at their outfits, right, she's very clearly in feminine clothing. I'm really, really bothered by this image here because of the point of view and the perspective. Not only is she wearing an incredibly short dress, but it's angled in a way that almost looks like an upskirt shot, which is very troubling to me. And her stewardess picture here, you can see her underwear. That's how short her dress is. Of course, both of these characters are very abled. They don't have any disabilities that are noticeable to the naked eye. And it's also bothersome to me the absolute enthusiasm that both of these characters have for their traditional gender roles. Neither the boys nor the girls seem necessarily interested in doing the opposite thing. This is the norm, and this is what they're happy with and comfortable with. And I think that is probably the biggest issue I have with a book like this. And again, we see this kind of pattern over and over and over again. So it's not just about one book and one character who acts a certain way or wears a certain thing. The problem is seeing these patterns and these stories show up over and over and over and over again. And how do we break free of that sort of pattern? So starting around the of course, the 60s, 70s, 80s, during sort of changes in women's rights and civil rights and feminist movements, you can see that there are these opposite kinds of influences on girlhood. So you have, these forces for progress. Babysitter's Club is a great example of this because the characters in the Babysitter's Club are fiercely independent. I would call them incredibly feminist characters. There's emphasis on things like education. There is some emphasis on diversity. We have, eventually in the Babysitter's Club books, they do include characters of color. And there's sort of these new and defining roles we see happening in our country and around the world in the 60s and 70s and 80s about what does it mean to be female? What does it mean to be male? So we have a lot of really positives influencing our literature, but at the same time, we have a lot of really negatives. So we have even more narrowing ideas of beauty standards. So the norm for what is considered beautiful is shrinking and shrinking, literally and figuratively. Of course, we have this increased sexualization of young girls and boys. All you have to do is go online and type in Halloween costumes for kids, and you can see immediately how absolutely overtly sexual these costumes are for kids as young as 4 or 5 years old. Of course, kids are being exposed to lots more different types of media. So even if they are seeing a lot of positive influences in their books and their television shows, they're also seeing just a ton of problematic images in the world around them. There's huge backlashes against feminist movements and women's rights. So there's pushes from different organized groups against any idea of progress or change for women. There still is, exclusion of specific kinds of diversity, consumer models that really, they privilege wealth over well-being. So what's going to sell is the most important part. One of the questions I posed when I described this talk was, are children, specifically girls, are they influenced by the images they see, or are the images a reflection of young girls? And unfortunately, I think the answer is way more the former than the latter. Girls are highly influenced by what they see in the world around them, and they're highly influenced by the actual images they see. And while the actual books themselves might be improving, it still has so much further to go to create images that are reflective of powerful, strong female characters. And I should add here that the importance isn't just for young girls. It's important for boys, girls, and everything in between to be exposed to these characters. We want young boys to see positive, strong female characters so that they normalize that as well. I wanted to mention too, of course, we now have technology that totally eliminates human flaws. So Photoshop, and you see images of girls and women in magazine ads, etc., and it's really problematic. There's a video I'm going to show at the end of this that kind of talks a little bit about that. So where are we now, right? So how do we end this? So first of all, there's a lot of positives. So over here on the left, we do have Doc McStuffins. Doc McStuffins is a current cartoon. She is African-American or a person of color. We can't totally tell in her story. She wants to be a vet. So she exists in her home, but she has like a playroom that turns into a vet's clinic. And when she's in that vet's clinic, then she gets to be a real vet through the amazingness of magic. And she is a career-focused girl. She has goals that center beyond what she looks like. She's wearing clothing that is both feminine, but also not necessarily stereotypically feminine. So she has these little leggings on. She is a girl, like she is 6 years old, as opposed to a 15-year-old playing a 6-year-old. She's not sexualized in any way. So there's some really, really positives with Doc McStuffins. And I also over here have Dora the Explorer. Same thing, right? So we have some diversity of culture and skin tone. We have Dora goes on these wild adventures to the safari and to the Arctic. And so she is, again, incredibly independent, and she's strong, both mentally and physically. They wear all kinds of different clothes. They are allowed to be as feminine or masculine and really as they want. Their attitudes almost kind of call back to the golden age. So they are curious, they're adventurous. They are very conscious of their own abilities, and they feel confident in their ability to be independent and to achieve their goals. But I have highlighted some of the problems, right? So they are still very thin and able-bodied. So we still don't see characters very often that are normalizing disability or normalizing difference. As a girl who grew up totally overweight always, I never saw a character. I still to this day have never seen a Disney princess that looks like me. And I never thought that was a real issue. A few years ago, this was before The Princess and the Frog. Disney had put out The Princess and the Frog. So this was actually now, I guess, about 10 years ago. I was teaching children's literature, and I had a woman in my class who was a mom, and she said she had taken her daughter to Disney World. And her daughter actually articulated to her mother, "Why do none of the princesses look like me?" Because there were no Disney princesses that were Black. And even now, when you start looking at the multitude of Disney princesses, we still only have a few who are of a different culture or different ethnicity and who have a skin tone that isn't the traditional white. And sometimes it's hard to notice that if you are the norm. So if you are part of the dominant culture, you might think, oh, kids don't notice if there are no Asian Americans in their books. But if you're Asian American, you absolutely are going to notice that. And that's where we start to see those problems, is who is still being excluded from our picture books and our cartoons and our magazines and those sorts of things. Again, I didn't want to do too many of these, but I wanted to read this quote as well. Everything we read constructs us, makes us who we are, by presenting our image of ourselves as girls and women, as boys and men. We who write children's books and we who teach through literature, and that would be teachers, parents, librarians, aunts, uncles, just responsible citizens, need to be sure that we are opening doors to full human potential, not closing them. We want to ideally expose girls and boys to as many different stories as possible. So this is sort of my like, okay, what does all this mean? And I'm condensing like miles and miles of, but what do I want you to take away from this? Well, first of all, that stories have power, that stories are not just for entertainment, and social values that they sort of instill in us, and we are shaped by our stories, and children are even more likely to be shaped by the stories they hear and they are exposed to. We have to tell our stories, right? So we individually need to be able to tell the stories that define who we are and express, who we want to be. And that doesn't have to just be about our gender and our sex. It can also be about our dreams and our hopes and our career paths and what we want out of life. We need to encourage other people to tell their stories. So we want to encourage authors who have maybe a different perspective than the norm. We want to see them publish. We want to see them write their stories and tell their stories. And we even want to encourage children to tell their stories, because the world that they live in might look drastically different than the stories that they're being told. And then most importantly, we have to listen to lots of stories. So it's not a matter of eliminating the Disney princesses from our repertoire, only powerful female XYZ authority. Our children and ourselves. So those patterns start. We're no longer beholden to something is or isn't, or what a girl should or shouldn't look like. We have to listen to lots of stories, and we have to expose kids to lots of stories, and we have to encourage lots of stories to be published and to grow. I do have a couple of resources here at the end. If any of you are parents or teachers or librarians looking for good resources for good stories, all of these are websites, or the top 3 are websites that you can actually go to and look at. And then the Schneider Family Book Award is actually a book award put out by the American Library Association that is specifically for books for children that celebrate disability in some way, and that capture the experience of being a disabled individual. The 1000 Black Girl Book Resources, that was actually created by an 11-year-old, and she decided that she wanted to create a library of 1,000 books that feature Black girls, and it wasn't always easy for her to find them. We Need Diverse Books is exactly what it sounds like, and A Mighty Girl. Both of those are resources that just give tons of book lists of texts that are empowering for girl readers. And again, we're not just talking about the images, we're talking about the actual content of the characters themselves. So I'd really like to end and be like, life is good and everything is positive, and let's set our girls free and help them to see the potential that's out there. But I also think it's important to recognize the scary side of things. So I did want to end with a specific video. Well, this is going to be a challenge, right? Because I'm not entirely sure if I can get this video to work. This is a Dove ad, and I will preface this by saying Dove is absolutely a part of the beauty industry, and they are interested in their profit margins, right? But at the same time, it's an incredibly powerful video, and I believe I have this set so not only you can hear it, but you can see it.
Melissa, when you share your screen, you have to share your computer audio. Do you know that?
Yes, and I clicked the button. So let me just try this for a second. Let's see, Denise. Can you hear anything? Can you hear that? No? Well then, let's figure this out together, people. We got this. Let's go. Stop share. Denise, what do I need to do?
When you share your screen,
All right.
typically, now that's when you're the
Share
host.
computer sound, right?
Yes.
Let's try this again. Let's go. Oh. We'll just really quickly go through this. There we go. All right, we're going to try this again.
Younger, smaller, lighter, fuller, tighter, thinner, softer. It really works.
So you can hear me, right? Still? Of course, there's a hypocrisy to that, right? Because it's a commercial created by Dove, and the parent company of Dove also is like the parent company of like Axe body spray, which is incredibly sexist sort of campaign. At the same time, though, I still really am impacted by that video, and I think what it reminds me is that, you know, we can keep progressing in our literature that we're purposely giving children, but we also have to be really aware of the kinds of images and portrayals that kids are exposed to, even if we're not consciously giving them to them. So we can have an amazing book like, I'm gonna stop screen share. So we can have a book like this. It's called Galaxy Girls, and it's 50 amazing stories of women in space. This is a really positive book, and it portrays all these different great stories of all these women who are doing amazing things as scientists. And yet at the same time, we are going to have these images infiltrating into our world, and this is how girls are going to see themselves and the world around them. So it's a conflict, and there's no really great answer right now yet, other than just we got to keep trying. So that's my thoughts on that topic, and I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts are too.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is great. Lots of you know, thought-provoking things. Be interested to hear from the rest of the folks here about maybe some of the books that shaped your image.
And if you want to talk, you'll have to unmute yourselves.
Okay.
Well, I like that there's no questions. What kind of girl characters did you influence you when you were a kid?
Anne of Green Gables, for sure. That's that was a series that I read over and over again.
You know, one of the things that's interesting about Anne of Green Gables is that liked her as a character, especially because she was really self-conscious about her red hair. And I identified, even though I couldn't find lots of characters that were overweight, I had this character that was really self-conscious about this part of her body and how she learned to embrace that. And of course, I wanted then red hair growing up. So even though it wasn't necessarily the same body image I had, it was a character who did have this sort of body image issue, and I really appreciated that.
Carrie Weiss said she loved Trixie Belden.
Niece, what did you say?
I said Carrie Weiss said she loved Trixie Belden.
Oh, Trixie Belden. Yeah. Don't know that character very well. And again, it's sort of that precocious sort of girl who is some of the stereotypes. A lot of mid-century 19th or 20th century B Jones, and of course Hermione and Katniss, and like a lot of more contemporary girls as well. So, and then I put my Wonder Women's behind me. Those are just some of my Wonder Women's. And Wonder Woman as a whole, we could do a whole talk about just Wonder Woman and how she's changed over time.
I loved Pippi Longstocking. I don't know if you can hear me, but probably because I was kind of a loner, and I didn't have like a traditional family life, and like I didn't fit a lot of categories, and so I just loved that she kind of normalized that. It was like she made it cool that you were not fitting.
Longstocking, again, she sort of counters that domestic story too, right? Because she doesn't just stay at home; she's out on these adventures. Now, Pippi Longstocking, I reread her a couple years ago, and there are some major racial like problems in that book, like issues. And so that's what you kind of find is you find these characters that do really amazing things, and then you take a step back and go like, but wait, we're still ignoring this problem. And I don't think we're ever gonna get to a stage where you can say, well, there's a perfect representation of a girl, because there's no one representation of a girl that fits everybody. But it is hard to sort of sift through these girls. I didn't include anything about Little House on the Prairie. There's so much there to unpack. And then we could talk about, there's like current controversies over this Netflix show called Cuties that I have not watched yet, so I can't comment on, but it's just, there's so much there.
What about the Brady Bunch? I feel like I OD'd on the Brady Bunch when I was a little kid, because it came out when I was kind of at the perfect age for that show. I don't know if you have any comments or if that's something you've looked into or.
Well, so again, Brady Bunch has some of the same problems that we see with sort of the retellings of Wizard of Oz, in that we have characters that are young but are being played by older characters. So everything is just automatically sort of shifted. So we have our youngest girl. That's not
Cindy.
Cindy, yeah. So even Cindy, despite being the youngest, she still has a developing body that is skewing what we see as like the normal sort of 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 16-year-old. Like it's all keeps progressing. I think that it's a great model for like a diverse family unit, and those girls and boys are like super diverse in their interests and the kinds of roles that they take. At the same time, then we also have this perpetuation of like the white, able-bodied, and of course, like any instance of like a body that is not thin, and the immediate like shut down of anybody that isn't fit like that beauty standard, which becomes a plot point for quite a few episodes. So yeah, I mean, there's different things going on there.
It's funny, and like what you brought up about race, and just the other things you find in the story. I got the series, I don't know, 8 years ago for my kids because I thought, oh, I really like the Brady Bunch. And I think it's the very first episode they get married. And this like harkens back to Tina's talk a couple weeks ago where she was talking about Mother's Little Helper. In that very first episode, there's like the split screen and Mr. and Mrs. Brady are trying to calm each other down about their anxiety about the wedding. And he asks her if she took something. And she says she did. And he says, well, take 2. And I just,
Yeah.
it was like the first episode. And as an adult now hearing it, it was like, oh, I don't, that went over my head when I was 7 or whatever.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Anne mentioned Judy B Jones, and of course she's a more contemporary girl, but yeah, she's she kind of is in the same tradition of Beverly Cleary's Ramona, and very precocious and very sort of rebelling against the norm. I would say that probably I think one of the absolute best narratives that challenges our stereotypes about what it means to be a girl is Sesame Street. Still today, I'm obsessed with Sesame Street. I'm sad about how there's been some recent changes in Sesame Street in the last couple of years, but that particular show was purposely done to give not just a single image of what it means to be a girl, but constant diversity of bodies and activities and gender norms, and both actually more in the real life characters and the live action than in the Muppets. So we still have a lot more male Muppets than female. But it's sort of astonishing how progressive that show was at the time. And it's interesting that we've sort of regressed away from that instead of this like general trend going upwards and progressive, it's a constant shift up and down. And in some ways, I think we are in a downward spin just in the last few years. If you actually look at the numbers of books being published with female main characters, it's actually decreasing since like 2012. I think there was a little bit of a flood in the market with some of the female characters in the late 2010s, and so we're backlashing a little bit from that. And of course, there's always going to be a cycle, but hopefully, as long as that trend just keeps progressively getting better, it's a positive.
I was just going to add, as we're talking about childhood and going into adolescence, but as a child of the 80s, trying to go back and watch some of the films that as an adolescent I loved and thought were just so great, and the horrible messages that were being sent to me as a woman, it's just shocking, that I watched repeatedly when I was 15 or 16.
Yeah. I show The Breakfast Club in my adolescent lit class, and I love everything about that movie except that it is incredibly sexist and it perpetuates horrific stereotypes. 16 Candles, same thing. I mean, even I had a clip on here earlier of Grease, and if you think about the ending of the movie, completely gives up everything she is. Boy, it's like, how is that in school? Like, we
repeatedly, right?
Now I look at it and think, well, and then also the fact they're like too.
Mm-hmm.
Their physicality is, kids already read up, so there's just a general understanding that older than them, but modeling their bodies, their physical bodies, off of people who are more mature than them physically. And then you couple that with TV shows that regularly cast adults into child characters, and that becomes really problematic. And of course, I mean, I know there's issues there too, because you can't always hire child actors. But I mean, Shirley Temple was up for the role of Dorothy in Wizard of Oz, and they went with, well, she was committed to a different studio, so she couldn't do Wizard of Oz. But I mean, how would that have changed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
To cast a girl who was more Dorothy's age. That might have completely changed the landscape of how we view that story.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of movies like Pretty in Pink too, the same issues, and there's like race issues, and Weird Science. Oh my.
Yeah, Weird Science is really bad. Yeah, we watch a lot of 80s movies over here, and it is hard to watch some of them. And I have a whole spiel about the book The Giving Tree, but I skipped that for you. It's all in there, but ask me sometime if you want to know my take on The Giving Tree, because it's really, again, problematic about the girl giving and the boy taking. And that narrative of boy giving or boy taking, girl giving is constant.
Mm-hmm.
It's that pattern that you see over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Denise, your face is so funny right now.
She know we can't hear her.
I thought I had muted my video as well. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I just
Lynn and I were looking at some
You crack
stuff.
up, but I can't hear you.
I was thinking I might jump in with a thought, if that's okay. I'm Rebecca.
Yeah, please do.
You able to hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I was thinking, I was reflecting, first of all, thank you for the topic, and I think this is fabulous. I appreciate joining the discussion today. I was thinking as you were talking about something I hadn't really, in terms of how my experiences with media as a kid, I think really contributed to sort of pushing me further from my femininity entirely as an alternative. I think I really just gravitated to the masculine models who I continue to be very much an outdoors person, right? So, you know, people like, I wanted to be Grizzly Adams, you know, I didn't want to be necessarily some of these other characters. I wanted to be Grizzly Adams or, you know, Bo and Luke do, because they were just, you know, crazy and adventurous and drove cars fast, and that seemed really fun and stimulating, you know. So I guess never really considered how much that that contributed to the work I later had to do in just re-identifying my, you know, with my femininity and my experience as a woman or as a female person. And so I'm seeing that a little bit differently today. I think that's been helpful as something for me to consider more.
Yeah, and has been a trend, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when as a reaction to having super stereotypical female characters, authors they truly would write male characters. Like that's how they would sort of subconsciously write their characters as males and then just make them female. And in the late 80s, there's an amazing article called Welding Brass Tits on Male Armor. And basically it's the whole criticism of you can't just take, excuse my language here, you can't just put boobs on a male character and say now it's a girl. That's not what the answer is. And we haven't even gotten to the whole idea of like, what is femininity and masculinity? Is it innate or is it constructed by society? I mean, that's a whole other world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, I really think it's important that the answer isn't to say, well, all girls should get to act like boys. The answer is that boys and girls should get to act whoever they are, no matter what their interests or their likes or their qualities are. Those are all celebrated, and there has to be that rich diversity of traits and characteristics, and there's a mix of those things too. So you can embrace certain seen as feminine activities and still be hyper masculine in other ways, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the biggest thing that I know I try to emphasize, because I'm working with teachers and future teachers a lot, is trying to help my students understand that kids are influenced by what they see, even if they're not consciously aware of it. So I get a lot of pushback from students who will say things like, well, kids don't notice if there's no Black people in this TV show. And my answer is, well, first of all, yeah, they do. They absolutely do. And it's easy for you to say that if you're not Black, but if you are, you absolutely notice it. Yeah. And two, even if you're not consciously aware of it, if you know, there's tons of studies where you go in classrooms and say, everybody in the class, draw a picture of a firefighter. And 99% of them are male. There was a great research study came out last year that showed the influence of X-Files and how girls who grew up watching X-Files have pursued STEM careers in ways that other girls don't. there's some question about whether those girls automatically watched X-Files or if one influenced the other. But I mean, there's a lot of research that shows, yeah, these stories really do influence how we then go on into our adult lives and the careers we pursue and the ways we express ourselves.
And who gets to tell the stories, whether you even think you get to tell a story, right?
Yeah. Well, if you're the norm story, right? So, you know, it's not just about having a character who is spunky and sassy and rebels against the norm, but is that accepted as the norm, or is that the center point of the story? So instead of having a character who is, I don't know, wants to go and be a NASA, you know, scientist, and the point of the story is, oh, she wants to be a NASA scientist, how rebellious of her, versus a story where, like, that's just, yeah, she wants to go be an astronaut, thumbs up, let's move on with the story. So that's also part of it too.
Yeah.
I think Roxanne's gonna say something. But you're on mute, so we can't hear you.
I get it. Okay, I got it. I got it. Denise keeps muting me and unmuting me, and so I don't know what I'm doing. Because we got a lot of background noise right now with kids in the museum. Just wanted to thank everybody, and Melissa, this was wonderful, and you've given me, like, I don't know, 100 different ideas to have you back to do some follow-up, because I think we all learned a lot.
Ooh, we could have a whole one just about Ursula and Little Mermaid and how she uses her voice. Like, there's a whole thing there I'm ready to talk about right now.
We need to get together and talk about some topics, because I think it would be fun to do an ongoing series.
I need to be able to leave my house, and I haven't since March. So yeah. This is the first time I put makeup on since March, everybody. I'm excited about it.
Well, thank you everybody for coming in. Remember that next week we have another at noontime, and well, it's not actually going to be the last one. Next week will be Tracy Bush finishing up with us, talking about the suffrage movement and the ERA. But then Melissa DeRosia is going to come back and do what we missed her last week, and she's going to be talking about gender roles and stereotypes. So that'll be the following Friday. So every Friday for another 2 weeks. And then we're going to try and do brown bags like this to go with every exhibit. So there'll be at least one a month. So anyway, thank you, everybody. And just a reminder that today is the last day to come see Women 2020 down at Artworks. We're going to close up at 4 and get ready for a whole long week of gala excitement.
Well, thanks for having me, everybody. This was fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Bye, you guys.
You were great, Melissa. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Marianne.